big announcer voice.
He came as a first century Jewish guy. A Jewish kid with strong Hebrew eyebrows, knobby knees, and chicken legs. He came with all that. All of the parts of being human, a particular person, a particular culture, and a particular day. He was wearing the garb of a first century Israelite, which meant a lot of things. It meant he would go to temple every time he turned around, and even though he knew everything was going to change, he still kept those traditions. He still kept Sabbath for most of his life. He constantly brought in that he wasn't there to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, to bring about what it was trying to bring. And he brought that about in himself. He was completing that story, building on the story that was already there. And in some sense, this is a reaction that any Gentile would expect in this case. Any Gentile woman, she was probably gearing herself up for that kind of reaction. It wouldn't have been out of place at all. There's really nothing out of place about it, except that it's Jesus, and he's always a little bit out of place. He's building on the foundation and the story that's already there, but he's always building out from it. He's always building out from it. He adds to it, he changes, he tweaks it. Just something he does all the way through the Gospels, from not observing the Sabbath on a particular day to trashing the temple. He's always doing something that takes him one step beyond, and yet there are times when he seems to observe these things. When he tells the leper, go to the priest and get the ritual done now that you've been healed. And I think what we have to look here is this is a heavily contextualized situation. This is a situation that is hard for us to exactly relate to. Jesus is not only taking on the clothing and the costume of the first century Jew, he is even taking on their cultural tensions here. When Jesus touches on what seems like such a strange comment is actually the larger picture of what God is up to. And it draws an important distinction for us. Jesus was sent to the lost sheep of Israel first. The plan was to come through Israel and out to the rest of the world. It's an important part of space-time history, not a bit of abstract theology. Jesus was not here just to do good things for people. Not just to be nice and teach other people how to be nice. But to bring the plan of God to its fulfillment. And in this instance, Jesus is not here to do miracles for everyone who walks in. And you may notice that he doesn't. Certainly there were a lot of sick people around. It was the first century. You lived to be about 40, and life was pretty hard most of the time. There were a lot of people he could have healed, and he didn't. He didn't. If we look at the places where Jesus does miracles, we see them tied into the story. He heals a man with a withered hand to teach a lesson about the Sabbath. He multiplies the food for the 5,000 to teach a lesson about Passover. It's all tied within the greater story. The miracles are part of the story, and the miracles were not the point of the story. So we don't see Jesus just walking around zapping people. At least that we have any record of. They were part of his intentional plan, just as sure as his time of resting was part of his intentional plan. I know I've told you guys some stories before about when I worked in state government. It was 8 terrifying months of working in the state government of Kansas. If you ever worked in government before, you know it is a highly regulated place with titles and hierarchy and a big picture that is all coming together, and you are part of it. And there are important lines that you do not cross, very important things you don't do that fit into that larger picture. I worked under a deputy secretary who was a friend of mine who I'd known for years, and I called him deputy secretary. And he worked under someone I called Mr. Secretary, and they worked under someone we called Mr. Governor. And you called them by their title. There was nothing personal about that, it was just part of the picture. For me to just go in and be like, hey Pedro, hey Rob, what's up guys? Would have broken down that bigger picture. Would have broken down the larger version. There's a reason things were in the place they were in. In a sense, I think that's what we have here with Jesus and this woman. Eventually, yes, the Spirit and the message and the grace are going out to all people. That was part of what was happening. But Jesus is staying with the plan here. I am sent to the lost sheep of Israel. He's not letting someone else run it. He knows the vision. He knows what he's about. And he pushed this lady back very strongly. And he's not going to just do miracles just to do them. And that brings us into some of the greater message of the gospel. People think that you can scrub out the strangeness of the gospel, the uniqueness of the gospel story, and come up with simply loving each other and giving good hugs. And there are churches this morning who are getting together for worship to talk about loving people and doing nice things for people, and not the gospel. And Jesus stands up against that here, saying, no, this is part of a story. It's not just me doing tricks for you. It's part of a story. So you have some churches that focus only on that, and that is unfortunate. And Jesus is stating here that I'm not just about healing people, I'm about the salvation of humanity.
Yes, amen.
And our culture right now, although much of it's not outright anti-religious, does love to tell us, these religious people, poor religious people, pat on the head, all your religions are the same, everybody get along. You all believe the same thing. Said as any non-religious person would say it. And we have to say no. It's not the truth. Doesn't mean we're not going to be kind. Doesn't mean we're not going to be understanding, but that is not the truth.
Yes.
Jesus came with a particular plan in mind. And the world and God's relationship with humanity coheres better than that. Jesus goes back to the vision that he had and his run-in with this woman. She's coming in a crazy way, breaking down all these rules and kind of blowing his cover. And Jesus took on the role he did for a reason. And very soon in the Gospel of Mark, the announcement will come that the gospel is for all peoples, as a Roman centurion stands up and says, surely this is the Son of God. Or in the old movie, it's John Wayne saying, surely this is the Son of God. And in the book of Mark, it's the outsiders who get it first. The insiders are the ones who don't get it. The outsiders are the ones who approach Jesus and start to see what's going on. And that brings us to the reality. The reality. As for the actual exchange, it's interesting. Again, people try to solve this in a lot of ways. Jesus says, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And why exactly he used this word dog is something I think we'll have to take up with him when we see him.
Amen.
For sure. To find out exactly what's going on. I think we have to look at this metaphor that dogs eat eventually. Jesus is framing a different kind of metaphor. He's taking that the children of Israel eat first. He came first to them, which is what happened. And the crumbs fell to everyone else, which is us. Jesus came to Israel first. But we still don't know exactly why he would choose such an offensive word to talk to somebody. It's interesting, though, her answer, that she goes round for round with him. She sort of gets back into this back and forth with him. Jesus uses the dog metaphor. She answers with the same metaphor. Jesus sees that, and he is struck by it. He must have had some sort of facial expression or something in his tone that told her this conversation is not over. Because it really usually would have been. I'm not here for you. Goodbye. But something drew her back into the conversation, and she stayed with him. A specific vision, a specific mission that he won't be taken away from. But things have changed now. And he can speak to her with dignity and grace and love.
Yes.
And she continues back and forth with him. And that's part of Mom's love here. She is sharply insulted, but continues on in her housecoat and curlers saying, no, my kid needs something.
Amen.
My kid needs something.
Yes.
And when my kids need something, then forget everything else. Jesus sees her love in her face. He sees the image of God glowing within her despite their separation. Despite her own expectations of him, which are murky and strange at best. He sees what's going on. And that's the reality. That is the reality of grace, the reality of Christ. And that is where the grace crumbs fall.
Amen.
If there are grace crumbs to be had, and there always are, Mama knows where to look for them. Mama knows how to cut across our pretension and self-preservation and speak from her heart to our heart, and in this case, from her heart to God's heart. And when it comes to her kids, Mama's not afraid to get down on the ground and look for what crumbs she can. And in a sense, this is a place where Mama's love caused God to change his mind. Think about that for a second. He didn't change his mind. He had a plan. I know. But think about how it looks. That's how fierce her love is, and that's how much Jesus respects him.
Amen.
Because of her love, he's able to play dumb, allow himself to enter into the conversation. We see this in another place where Jesus makes wine at a wedding because Mom told him to go do a miracle. And he says, "It's not time, Mom." But he goes and does it anyway. We see grace crumbs all over, grace crumbs everywhere. Jesus is constantly breaking the rules, constantly stepping out of what he came to step into. And that is the reality. And that is the change. And I think of when I was in state government, and the guy who was over me, deputy secretary, very serious, very scary, he had a Bolivian accent. And every time I hear a Bolivian accent, and he got fired, which was kind of pleasant, actually. He got fired. I went in to see his replacement the next day, and I said, "Excuse me, deputy secretary." And the guy, I can tell you what he was wearing, how he was sitting. That's how it stayed with me. I said, "Excuse me, deputy secretary." He turned around and he said, "Good morning, my name is Gary." Josh, my name is Gary. This is different. Jesus had to step in a certain culture at a certain time to do things in a certain way, and yet there are the crumbs all over the place. Grace crumbs all over, left and right. So what are your grace crumbs today? What is the trail of crumbs that you are following today? God has a great plan for all things and all people. But there are times when it seems to make no sense. There are times when he seems to insult us right to our face. And there are times when we get glimpses of how the plan comes together. But usually not. Usually not. And we are left insulted. And those times we can learn from this mom who scraped and scrambled and prayed and entreated and beat the heavens until the grace crumbs fell. We look for grace crumbs, and she took what she could get. And God honored that. I don't pretend to have this exchange entirely tied with a bow. One of a few things I'll be asking Jesus when I see him. But the cool thing is, when I do ask him, this woman will be right there, and I can talk to her about it. Amen. And so will her daughter. Amen. And so will so many other people. Amen. And by then, I'll be in the presence of Christ and know that he had the best in mind. So 3 things today. 3 things today. There you go. Jesus built rest into his plan. Rest is a spiritual discipline and among the most neglected. Amen. Jesus had 3 years to demolish and restore humanity and took time to rest several times within there. And when it comes to Mother's Day, we need to give our ladies rest. Whether they are biological mothers, church mothers, or both. We need to focus on them for a while. Mama gives so much, more output than any of us can imagine. What can we do to focus back on her and make her rest if we have to? In our family, we do Mom's afternoon off every Friday. Sometimes I have to chase Heather out of the house. Go, get. Fortunately, my wife knows herself well enough to know what she needs. Time at the coffee shop doing her art. Time to see some awful chick movie. That kind of thing. These are things that seem small, but they make all the difference. And our Savior modeled resting for us. The run-in. Mama crashes in, her curlers falling out, her bunny slippers coming off, and throws herself down on the floor. And she stops it all. And Jesus stops with her. And that's one of the most amazing gifts I've ever seen in motherhood with my wife and our kids. I get in the mode of, okay, bedtime, eat time, playtime, discipline time, whoosh, clean time, bedtime, repeat. Heather can stop on a dime and say, "Wow, good job." Or she can get in a tickle fight, or tell them a story, or listen to one of their stories. No. She can just stop and do that. It's amazing. It's amazing. And Jesus says, "Hey, I'm here for the lost sheep of Israel, but let's stop this whole thing. Stop with me." And he models more than once that he can stop everything. Who touched me? And a whole crowd of people, who touched me? He stops it all. just like Mom does, because he made that mother's love. The other point on that run-in to remember is that Jesus came with a particular vision and mission in mind. He didn't come just to do nice things for people and encourage everyone to get along. He came to bring about redemption and the strange and beautiful story of the resurrection. And we have service and we have love to give. And we have a story to tell. And we need to intertwine the two and hold those realities together. The reality. Josh, my name is Gary. Thinking about this sermon got me thinking about the different times that Jesus was disturbed on his way somewhere. When the woman touched the hem of his robe. When Mary asked him to do a miracle at the wedding even though it wasn't time yet. When the blind man kept yelling, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Right when Jesus is in the middle of everything else. Most of the gospel stories we have are of interruptions. Most of the gospel stories we have are of interruptions. And what reveals someone's true character is when you catch them off guard. And what happens? Right? And most of the stories we have are of Jesus being caught off guard. Almost across the board. Absolutely. In these interruptions we see who he really is. Who God really is. He steps across those ancient cultural divides and says, "Who touched me?" And he's the one on the floor with us at the end of the day.
Thank you, Lord.
Looking for the grace crumbs. So amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for your love for us, your kindness to us. Help us to keep looking for that light that quote-unquote accidentally comes through, because it always does. And it is so hard to hide from. Help us not to hide from it today. Help us to look for your grace crumbs that are being spilled left and right, that we may feast. Amen.